So the idea is that Hanukkah is the festival of miracles. And we recite Al Nisim, and really the version we have of Al Nisim in the prayer book was written originally for Hanukkah. They added something for Purim and interesting for Yom Ha'atzmaut, but Hanukkah is the holiday that explicitly mentions and glories and miracles. What's interesting, and I'm not going to go in this direction, but of course other holidays have miracles too, and one could argue that the Pesach miracles are much more impressive. You have the crossing of the Red Sea, which liberates the people. I mean, there's no people without all the miracles in the Pesach story, whereas the primary miracle in the Hanukkah story is ultimately not that important. The fact that the lights stayed lit for longer than they should have actually means nothing. Really, I mean, it doesn't feed anybody. It doesn't liberate the people. The people, in fact, had been liberated already. And you could say that the other Hanukkah miracle is the military victory, which we could talk about. I'll talk about that at services more. But so the point is, for some odd reason, Hanukkah is the festival of miracles, where we sing Al Nisim, Nes Gadol Hayasham, and we formalize a memory of miracles. We're remembering these miracles that God did for us. So what I'm going to do now is show you different models of how we remember miracles in Judaism. One could lead us astray, and one I think is really important. Okay? And I'm actually not going to focus on the Hanukkah miracle. I'm going to focus on the Exodus miracles, which are a prime example of miracles, but the idea of remembering miracles and what to do as a people with memories of those miracles is what we'll be discussing. So first I want to talk about not such a well-known king, although some of us have heard Irv. Is Irv here? Oh yeah, Irv talk about this. This is Josiah, King Josiah, who was considered one of the greatest kings in the First Temple period in the Book of Kings. He was considered a great king because he was a great reformer. So he got rid of the idol worshippers once and for all and all the pagan hilltops, and he found a book in the middle of his kingdom which led to a series of revolutionary reforms. And that's the book of, well, it doesn't actually say. Many scholars assume it's the book of Deuteronomy. So among other things in the book is a mention of how you're supposed to observe Pesach. So I want to just read that, and we're not going to go into too much detail about it, but this is the story here we're going to read of, it's not so much Josiah finding the book of Deuteronomy, but in many ways panicking because he finds the book, which comes from God. It's one of God's books. It's one of the books of the Torah, and it tells the people to do a bunch of things that they haven't been doing. And the most important that they haven't been doing is celebrating Pesach. So that's very interesting, isn't it, too? Because Josiah comes hundreds of years after the Exodus. And one of the impressions that you're left after reading the story is that the people hadn't been celebrating Pesach all those years. Mind-blowing. Yeah, it is. And in fact, if you read it closely, we'll see it's almost as if even the people that left Egypt somehow forgot this book that told them how to celebrate leaving Egypt. Anyway, I'm going to just read it. The king commanded all the people, saying, "Keep the Passover unto the Lord your God, as is written in this book of the covenant. For there was not kept such a Passover from the days of the judges that judged Israel, nor in all the days of the kings of Israel, nor in the kings of Judah. But in the 18th year of King Josiah was this Passover kept to the Lord in Jerusalem." Okay, that's all, because I don't have that much time. That's all I'm actually going to read for this. Just tell us, it's actually pretty astonishing. Josiah actually comes towards the end of the first kingdom. Josiah's in roughly the year 650, and the Judah, the southern kingdom, ends in 586. So there isn't much left in the first Commonwealth. And they hadn't been celebrating Pesach at all. That's the implication. Now, maybe they'd been doing something. They've been marking something. But the Pesach that we seem to have in the Torah, which is mostly from the book of Devarim, I mean the actual ritual, which becomes our Passover Seder, which is the story, telling the story. What is it, by the way, in the Torah? What's the central Pesach ritual in the Torah? Anybody remember? It's in Deuteronomy. It's the Korban Pesach. So it's the sacrifice of Pesach. The sacrifice which is accompanied by telling the story. So Josiah finds this book and say, whoops, like there's this holiday we didn't even know about. Why wouldn't they know about it? I mean, it's right. I mean, it seemed like there'd be some. So probably they remembered the incident, but the idea that there'd be a holiday I said Josiah. So one might say, and that's the most important thing Josiah discovers in the book. He also discovers, hey, we're not allowed to worship idols, but they sort of knew that already. Prophets had been telling them that. Well, the book is more explicit about it, but it's this description of Pesach, and Josiah says, like, we are really in trouble now because we haven't been worshiping God that way, and we haven't been celebrating Pesach. And so, I mean, one might say, and this is going to be my theory, but I think it's warranted in the text. Josiah becomes almost obsessed with Pesach. Pesach becomes really important to him. And the story of Pesach becomes really important to him. Now, the story of Pesach is a story of God liberating the Jewish people through miracles from the land of Egypt. That's what the story is. I mean, there's no story if there's not the Red Sea crossing or the 10 plagues, everything God does for the people. And if you remember, the people are fairly passive, aren't they, really? I mean, they do things, but it's not, right. It's not only that they're passive, they're the opposite of passive, they're resisting it. Over and over again, they tell Moses, "Leave us alone. We don't want this. What's going to happen to us is we're all going to die in the desert." So Moses says that. The people say that to Moses over and over again. So God actually, in some ways, has to take them and that's the descriptive language you have in the Torah. Often, I took you out of there on the wings of eagles. You had very little to do with it, right? I mean, even Moses, in the way we tell the story. Now, I'll tell you something. It's interesting too. So in this book of Deuteronomy, now, according to tradition, who wrote that book? Moses. It's Moses' final speech. God wrote it. We'll say God wrote it. But it's Moses' words. So in Moses telling the story of the Exodus from Egypt, and then in the rituals, what important character is not in that story? And there's another hint. I mean, he's also not in our Haggadahs. Moses. What's interesting, it's not just that Moses isn't in the Haggadah. Look over Deuteronomy and Moses' description of what happened. Moses takes himself out of it. That's why we say Moses is such a humble person. In his telling the story, he takes himself out of it. But the idea of course God is so central because it's God's miracles and remembering God's miracles. All right. Yes.
They did have to put a sign on their door, but they did physically have to make a sign on the door so that the angel of death would pass over them.
You're talking about in Exodus, right? So
Exodus from Egypt. So the Israelites had one thing that they did have to do. They had to do in order to.
Yes, so that's a good point. The book of Exodus mentions a little bit some of the rituals themselves, including the blood on the doorpost. Now, if you read that. And I just want to clarify, because we don't have time to go back and forth with the text. It's all right. It's a good point. The ritual that's mentioned in the book of Exodus seems to be what the Jews are supposed to do that night, the night they're going to leave. Right. And in fact, that's the narrative. The narrative is, okay, you guys are leaving, and here's some things I want you to do now to remember this night. It's not 100% clear. You could debate back and forth, but it's not 100% clear that those rituals are supposed to be done all the time. And in fact, we don't do them. We don't spread blood on our doorways now. And
except in India.
Yeah, there are places that do, or people that, like Ethiopian Jews, will actually stand during the Seder, which actually they were instructed to do that night. Why? Because that night they were going to leave. So don't eat standing up. So Ethiopian Jews eat standing up. But the fact is, Deuteronomy has the ceremony from A to Z, at least for biblical times, for the holiday, as it's supposed to be practiced for all time. And somehow Josiah finds that, and he's very worried because they haven't been doing it, so he reinstitutes it. So let me tell you a little bit about Josiah, what happens to Josiah, because it's a very important story, an odd and puzzling story. A lot of people don't know it. Part of it is because, we don't read the rest of the Bible every week. We just read the Chumash, the 5 books. So here's what happens to Josiah. The Bible loves Josiah. He's a great king. He institutes all these rituals that we hadn't done before. He gets rid of the idol worshippers, but he does something very strange at the end of his career. So we understand where Israel's located geographically, ancient Israel, the Judah and Israel, those 2 kingdoms. They're located between 2 immense empires, 2 superpowers. Egypt on the south, and on the north is, we'll say Babylonia. But there's a series of empires that kind of Iraq and Iran, that whole area. Sometimes it's Babylonia, sometimes it's Persia, sometimes it's Assyria. And the ancient world is defined by the conflict between these 2 great empires. Just like the United States and Soviet Union when I was growing up, and to some extent the United States and China now. So there's these 2 great empires, and everybody in between has to kind of march to that tune. And to the extent that they balance each other out, the countries in between can flourish. But when they're fighting each other, it's bad news for all those countries in between because they go back and forth. So Israel, as a kingdom, really relies on a kind of balance of power where these two kingdoms are just kind of in stasis. Okay, so every once in a while, though, one of the kingdoms decides, I have to invade and fight the other kingdom. And then Israel's in between. Nobody cares about Israel that much. It's this tiny thing. They care about it as the bridge between these two empires. So one day, for various reasons, the Pharaoh in Egypt decides, I'm taking over. I've had enough with those Babylonians. Now, how do you get to Babylonia? From Egypt, you have to go, you can't avoid Israel. If you want to, you could go straight through Israel. But the king of Egypt actually was trying to be a little bit careful in this instance, and he was going up the coast. And there's no Israel in the coast in those days. Today it's Tel Aviv and Rishon LeZion. Then it was the Philistines. It was a different kingdom. So he goes up through the coast, and he's got to spend a little time around Megiddo. This is Armageddon, around Megiddo, and he's got to turn and he's got to attack Babylonia that way. That's how he's going to get to Babylonia. And the king of Israel, Josiah at the time, decides, I'm going to stop him. There's no motivation given. It's just that he doesn't want him coming through our kingdom to get to Babylonia. You could, if you wanted to, come up with some motivation, but it's not given in the Bible. So I'm going to tell you what happens, and then I'm going to tell you why I think it happens. So what happens is that Josiah gets an army, a tiny army. It's Israel, it's Judah, a tiny army, and he tries to stop the Egyptians from coming through. And what happens? He loses. He loses, and he dies in battle. That's the end of Josiah. Now, the fact is, what's interesting is that the king of Egypt tried to reason with him. They have a little parley ahead of time. And he sends him a letter, and he says, it's actually very famous, and in Hebrew we still use it, Mali Valach. The king of Egypt, Pharaoh says, what are you bothering with me? What argument do we have with each other? We've got no argument with each other. Just let me through. It'll take me 5 days. Let me no time to get through. I'll take nothing. Just get out of the way. That's all I'm asking. And he doesn't get out of the way. So here's my theory is that Josiah now is obsessed with the story of Egypt, right? And figures, well, God helped us back then.
You're going to help us now.
Well, that's the whole story of Egypt is God helped us back then, so God will help me now. And so what if I'm outnumbered? We were outnumbered back then. We didn't even have an army back then. The Red Sea crossed. So Josiah feels like God will be on his side. Okay. So let me talk to you for a second about what we do with memories of miracles in Judaism, and then what the alternatives are. So one thing we could do with miracles, memories of miracles, is we can be totally passive. We can just say, God took care of me back then. Right? We were in Egypt and we were slaves, and you wait for God to act. Most people understand this was most of Jewish history. Yeah. Most of Jewish history until like 1948, for this 2,000 years was, we'll just wait. The Messiah is going to come. We don't really have to do anything. At some point, we remember these miracles. We have stories of these miracles. When God finally decides, then we'll be out of here. And the Messiah will come and we'll be strong again. So that's one possible reaction. There's actually a flip side of that, which actually comes from an identical mindset in remembering miracles. The flip side of that is that we will just go ahead and grab history by the horns, and it doesn't matter if we're outnumbered, because who cares if we're outnumbered? Because God will help us, right? I mean, and both still exist in Judaism today. There's the idea we'll be totally passive, God will save us. There's also this idea, and here I don't think I'm getting into politics. I'm gonna mention people that live on very ideological settlements in Israel really do believe this. Like if you talk to them and say, well, what makes you think you can get away with this? You've got the entire world against this particular hilltop settlement. And I'm not talking about the geopolitics of it and what it makes sense for Israel to give up and not give up. I'm talking about people who are driven by a deep ideology that they will say to me, and I've heard it, who cares? It doesn't matter. God will protect us. That's why we are there. We are moving now into these settlements because we feel that God is on our side. And that hyperactive attitude towards history is just the flip side of the very passive attitude towards history. So this is, by the way, so I would say this is one approach. It manifests itself in two different ways, a very passive way or an active way, but essentially it's the same approach. I'm taking that memory of miracles and I'm assuming that's going to happen again. So what do we do with that? Because both are not very helpful. Really, I mean, they're not. I mean, there wouldn't be an Israel today if we were passive, totally passive. But if you get too active, you start to ignore, hey, there's China out there. There's a billion Muslims out there. If you start to ignore them, think, oh, well, God will take care of it, you know where that's going to end. And it hasn't ended well in Jewish history when we've done that before. That's like the Bar Kokhba rebellion.
Yes.
Right. So one possible response to this is that you just X the miracles out of the story itself. I don't believe in miracles. I will be a totally, fully, and completely secular Jew, and those miracles will mean nothing to me. They're just folk tales. And there are people that think that, like Christopher Hitchens, the famous atheists. They'll say that these things, in fact, are harmful. So I can't go there either, because I'm a person of faith, and there's something about the miracle stories, I think, that invigorate us, that nourish us. That's why we celebrate Hanukkah. So I'm looking for a third way, something in between waiting for God or expecting God to kind of intervene for us and rejecting the miracle stories altogether. So here's where we want to go to some other texts, which I think will give us the third way. And I've got 3 more minutes, so it may not be quite enough time. Yeah, all right. So we have the Ten Commandments. Okay. So if you remember the Ten Commandments stories, I mean, the Ten Commandments is this huge sound and light show. I mean, it's another manifestation of God, which is a powerful supernatural display, like a miracle. So some of you remember what happens. So what happens is God gives the people the Ten Commandments in God's own voice. And then what do the people say? People say, enough, I can't take this. Stop talking, because the voice is too powerful. So who's supposed to talk now, after the Ten Commandments? Moses. I'm not going to read the Ten Commandments. I will read the first one. Oh, the first one's not there, sorry. Yeah. So yes, I meant to have it there. The first one is, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Right? So the first thing God gives as a commandment is, remember that I brought you out of the land of Egypt. Okay? Then there's the rest of the commandments. Lovely commandments. We're not going to study them. But what's interesting is God says, the people say, stop talking. We can't stand your voice. So now it's Moses' turn to speak. What's the first thing Moses says when it's his turn to speak? Now he's going to give some commandments, okay? So that's what happens in this text on page 3. It's Exodus 20. The previous text is most of the Ten Commandments, it was a typo. Some got left out. So here's Moses talking. These are the ordinances which you shall set before you. If you buy a Hebrew servant, 6 years he shall serve, and in the 7th he shall go for free for nothing. The first thing that Moses is talking, the first commandment he gives is, you have to free your slaves. Here's a sermon. It's just a sermon about it, okay? It took me 30 seconds. When I say sermon, I'm differentiating it from a real argument, like from real life. A sermon is an interpretation, okay, with an ethical message which may or may not be fully accurate with the text itself. So my sermon is that, what Moses is saying is God introduces himself as the God who liberated you from Egypt. So your number one obligation, in my opinion, Moses is saying, is you better not have slaves. You better free your slaves. That's my sermon. So my sermon is that the obligation that flows from the Ten Commandments, in fact, from our entire story, is to free slaves. Now the thing is, that you might say that's a stretch. All right, it's not obvious in there. Moses isn't saying, hey, because God introduces himself as your liberator, therefore you should be a liberator. It's not such a stretch, though. It fits pretty well. It's a nice sermon. It works as a sermon. But later, so the Ten Commandments come again in the book of Deuteronomy, which once again is entirely Moses' voice. Remember, the book of Deuteronomy is Moses telling the story. When Moses tells the story, he does some amazing things. He leaves himself out of the story. That's pretty amazing. So now he's telling the Ten Commandments, and now we have in Moses' voice, Moses' sermon, which is Moses' take on, first of all, what the Ten Commandments mean ideologically and essentially, but also another way, this is from Moses, another way of dealing with miracles. Okay? So now we're going to read the verses that come directly after the Ten Commandments in the book of Devarim, of Deuteronomy. Okay? First of all, and you'll see it's very parallel, but with significant differences. If your brother, if your brother or Hebrew man or Hebrew woman assaults you, first of all, you don't even have the word eved here. In the previous passage in Exodus, you have eved. What do you have here? Your brother. Right. So this is Moses talking. Moses is now doing some interpretation of his own. Moses is saying, don't think of your slave as a slave. Remember that your slave is a brother. I want to say something else, and I'll take questions. Moses also introduces the idea of king. Some of you are in my class, it was a couple weeks ago, where we talk about God, but really Moses, introducing the idea of a king. Does anybody remember how Moses refers to the king? He says you can set yourself a king among achicha, among your brothers. The king is called a brother. The slave is called a brother. Moses is destroying hierarchies here. He says essentially there's no hierarchies. The slave is your family, your brother, and the king. So Moses now is saying, now remember that a slave is your brother. I'm going to keep going. When you set him free, you shall not let him go empty-handed. All right? And that's it. You shall furnish him liberally out of your flock, your threshing floor, out of your winepress. Of that wherewith the Lord your God has blessed you, you shall give to him. Now, he gives the rationale behind it. Now, I had that rationale in my sermon, but it wasn't explicit in the text. But Moses makes it explicit in the text, because Moses is saying, you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore, I command you this thing today. Moses makes the solid connection between the Ten Commandments, where God introduces himself as, I'm the one who liberated you, and the entire Exodus story, including our most important miracles. And Moses says there's an ideology behind the miracles, an ideology which manifests itself in the first of the Ten Commandments, which we have to follow. In other words, what do the miracles teach me? The miracles teach me that I also have to be a liberator. God's our liberator, therefore I have to be a liberator. So now, I'm going to contrast, and I'll stop. I'm going to contrast the two approaches to remembering miracles, really three. One I'm rejecting totally, which is that we reject the miracles. We just write them out of the stories. So, I mean, that you can take that if you want. It's just not my approach right now. So the other two approaches are, so we remember the miracles, so we assume God will do those miracles again for us, right? Either passively we do nothing, or we'll go in, we'll conquer any territory. So that's one approach. I've suggested that's a dangerous approach. Moses now, not me, Moses now introduces another approach. The other approach is you remember the miracles. Within the miracles are ideologies, ideas, sensibilities, and we act on not the miracles themselves, but the sensibilities. So the sensibility behind the miracles of the Exodus are liberate slaves. So we internalize the message of the miracles, and we have to then liberate our slaves. Our slaves, in fact, are slaves. Our slaves are brothers. Hanukkah too. So, and I'll stop here because you have to do the work yourself for Hanukkah. What are the basic ideologies in Hanukkah? Never mind the miracles. Don't wait for God. If you're going to wait for God to light your candles for you, you're going to wait a long time. Instead, there's an ideology, a sensibility in the miracle stories. You have to internalize those and act on those. Yes.
Well, this is what you do if your slave is a Hebrew. Does that mean it's a different set of rules if you're not?
Yeah. So, well, what I would say is that so maybe Moses doesn't go as far as we would like in establishing the ideology. He starts with the Israelites, the Hebrew slaves. For sure, you shouldn't have Hebrew slaves. They're your brother. There's not a I'm trying to think of a way to say this. There's a pretty slippery slope from there to all people are brothers. You can brothers and sisters. You can certainly find that in the Bible themselves. So no one should have slaves, and that's I think the evolution of the morality there. So Moses starts with Israelites, but I think it's a pretty logical leap, and that sensibility, that ideology is certainly in the story.
But they're freeing the slaves only after they're getting 6 years of work.
Yeah, so they become workers. Remember, remember the slaves there sold themselves into slavery.
That's right.
But it's very important that you pay them in the end.
Yeah.
Which also, by the way, happened in the story. And that's what's so fascinating about this is that the Israelites, when they left Egypt, you remember they snuck into the Egyptian houses under cover of darkness and they stole everything they would need. But did they steal it? Well, no. The Egyptians owed them it for 400 years of slavery. So the Bible's incorporating that into your own liberation story. You have to give them everything. So basically you're paying them for 6 years of labor.
But there's a more powerful message. It's the introduction of the man-to-man relationship as opposed to man-God relationship, which I think is really profound in that dimension.
Yeah, absolutely. So in other words, you take the God-man relationship and you institute it in your own dealings with fellow human beings. And that's the Bible standing on one foot. That's God is kind and gracious, so you should be kind and gracious.
It's interesting, the idea of your brother. Because, most of us think of slaves, we think of how countries marauded. They would invade other countries and take their people, like the Romans, and use them as slaves.
Right. Property.
And I guess Israel didn't do this, so they didn't have all these foreign slaves. And I'm wondering if there was any other place in the Middle East that put a time limit on slavery. And then as far as miracles are concerned, I guess you could look at miracles as sort of serendipitous. That there's a need, and it's nice if it happens, but you can't count on it because all those people in the Holocaust didn't have a miracle.
Yeah.
And there's an example that it doesn't always come.
And there was, it wasn't entirely because of this. In fact, I'm not sure if this was even dominant, but there was some passivity in the Holocaust itself where rabbis were recommending to their flocks, just stay put. Eventually God will save us. And in fact, we have the writings of some of those rabbis where that was the advice, as opposed to get out of here. Let's make our way to someplace safe. And some people ended up staying because of that.
It was 1,000 miles to any place safe.
Well, even in the 30s, people were. When they potentially could have left. A lot of people left. There were people that left. Yeah. That's the whole whatever. It's the third Aliyah in Israel. It was made up of refugees from the Nazis in the 30s. So there were significant people that left. Obviously, not enough. Okay, thanks everybody. Happy Hanukkah.